Join me while I harvest worm castings from my DIY worm bin. This is an 18-gallon tote from Walmart. There are no holes in the lid, but there are small holes about 1 inch apart all along the top edge. There are also 6 large holes in the bottom for drainage, but that's not needed if your worm bin is balanced. And by balanced, I mean the appropriate level of moisture. The goal is to flip the bin perfectly upside down. It's harder than it looks. Today, I'm harvesting worm castings from my worm bin. And the method I'm using is basically, I'm going to call it the sunlight method. The worms will move away from the light to the bottom of the pile. I'll then be able to scoop off handfuls of the worm castings and set them aside. Let the worms go down again. Once I harvest the worm castings, I'll be able to reconstruct the bin. I'm going to go ahead and get my bedding soaking. For bedding, I use shredded paper that I soak in water for 10 minutes. For the bedding, I'm using shredded paper. I asked my neighbors to collect it for me. And I've got water in my bucket, and I'm just going to let the shredded paper soak for 10 minutes before I add it to the bin. The reason I'm soaking the paper before I add it to the bin is because I never pour liquid directly into my worm bin. The moisture content is super important. Worms breathe through their skin, and without the proper level of moisture, it's very difficult for them to breathe. I'm letting the paper soak for 10 minutes so it can fully absorb the water. Then I'm going to wring it out when I add it to the bin. I'm going to let my worm bin that I have dumped out sit for a couple hours before I start scooping off the top and harvesting the castings. The contents of my worm bin have been allowed to sit for several hours, and ideally the majority of the worms have started making their way to the bottom of the pile to get away from the light. You're probably thinking, wow, this looks like it takes a really long time. And it does take time. However, the majority of the time is just letting the pile sit to allow the worms to move to the bottom. I'm not actively managing this process for the majority of the time that I'm doing it. And yes, you can buy a worm bin online. They tend to be expensive, and from what I've seen, most of them are not designed with the worms in mind. The research I've done, and I will link several of the sources in the caption of this video, leads me to believe that this DIY bin and this method of harvesting castings is the best one. Once I've been able to move all the castings and very few worms over to this pile, I'm going to put the rest of the bedding and the worms back into the newly prepared bin. Here's my pile, and again, I'm going to let it sit for several hours. I'm repeating the process, and I'm carefully taking off the top layer of the pile so that the worms can again move towards the bottom. The pile on the left is mostly castings and some bedding that's stuck together. And the pile on the right, if you can see, has worms in it that are going to need to make their way to the bottom. I'm finally at the stage where I'm going to start harvesting the castings. I can carefully remove the top layer, and there are very few worms in the top layer. If I do find some worms, I'm putting them back in the bin.
See how all the worms have moved to the bottom of the pile? That goes straight into the worm bin. So the tops of the pile are being harvested for castings, and the bottoms of the pile will go back in the worm bin. There will still be a few worms while you're harvesting the castings, and I'm a bit of a control freak and want to save every last one. I'm done harvesting castings, and this pile is mostly worms, and it's going to go back in the worm bin. I'm going to show you how many worms have moved to the bottom of the pile. I'd also like to take this opportunity to let you know that not just any worms are great for worm composting bins. There are specific worms that you would want to purchase. The worms that work well for composting don't mind being in confined spaces and are powerhouses when it comes to going through food scraps. The worm bin has been put back together, and now I'm going to feed it before I close it up. I like to chop the food up very small, and these are just kitchen scraps. Covering the food really well is super important. I'm using saved leaves, but you could also use more of the soaked shredded paper. Worms are like us, they don't want to be too hot or too cold, so I keep my bin in my garage. And then you can take it one step further and be extra and sift the worm castings if you want to. And now I have beautiful worm castings to use to help feed the soil and my plants.